Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar about the next steps in the battle to end homelessness. I'm Martin Hilditch, editor of Inside Housing. Today's event, sponsored by Global Guardians, is an attempt to unpick what the sector's focus should be moving forward. In a moment, I'll introduce the panel we've got lined up to speak to you today, but first a bit of background to set the debate. Today can hardly take place at a more crucial moment. Certainly it marks a turning point in England from the approach taken to tackle homelessness so far in the pandemic. This week, the moratorium on evictions in the country, introduced as we went into lockdown, ended. Homelessness charities, the Chartered Institute of Housing, the London Mayor, among others, have warned that in the absence of other policy changes, we could now face a dramatic growth in evictions and people struggling to meet their housing needs. The end of the furlough scheme could create a perfect storm for many individuals and families. Of course, the pandemic so far has seen a huge national effort to house rough sleepers in particular, but there is uncertainty over the future of a review into rough sleeping launched by the government in February before the pandemic bit. So what's the direction of travel? Where are we going? What's the strategy here? And irrespective of the pandemic, we were facing significant challenges with 93,000 homeless households in temporary accommodation in England at the end of March, just as lockdown began, an increase of a best part of 10% on March 2019. One step the government has taken was to increase the local housing allowance rate when the pandemic struck. While this was welcome, it also raised fresh questions about the adequacy of the benefit system and the extent to which it contributes to people's housing difficulties. With today's webinar, we'll be asking about the lessons learned in lockdown and how they can inform the direction of travel moving forwards. And we'll be asking what package of support can ensure that there won't be an upsurge in homelessness and rough sleeping. As I mentioned, we've got a fantastic panel lined up for you today to give us their thoughts and suggest the next steps for the homelessness lobby. We'll be hearing from Dominic Williamson, Executive Director of Strategy and Policy at St Mungo's, Joanne Drew, Director of Housing at the London Borough of Enfield, Stuart Woolgar, the Chief Executive of Global Guardians, Bridget Carey, Project Manager, Action on Empty Homes, and Gillian Higson, the Director of Housing and Landlord Services at Bristol City Council. Before we start, though, a reminder that this is your opportunity to ask the questions that are the most pressing for you in the day job, and hopefully to get the answers that will enable you to inform your thinking moving forwards and the direction of travel. So please use that Q&A box on the screen, ask questions all the way through, and I'll pick up on as many as possible in the discussion that follows the presentations. So yeah, just keep those questions coming, and I'll remind you as we go along. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dominic to kick things off. Dominic, it's over to you.
Right, thank you, Martin, and thank you to Inside Housing and to Global Guardians for organising the discussion and the webinar today. And thanks for all coming. The title, Continuing the Homelessness Conversation Post-COVID-19, seems quite optimistic this week as we talk about the almost certainty of going into a second spike of the pandemic. But I think it's a really good moment to reflect on what's been happening over the last few months and to see what we can learn from that and to see what we need to do moving forward. First of all, just very briefly about St Mungo's. I'm sure lots of you know we're a leading homelessness charity and a housing association. On any one night, we've got about 2,850 individuals in our supported housing. We help around 30,000 people a year through our all our other services. We have outreach services across the south of England, London and the south of England. And we also run the Street Link service, which I know many of you will be familiar with, which is a phone and app service for connecting people who are sleeping rough to services. Just looking back, I think almost exactly 6 months now to the situation we were in before the pandemic, it's worth just, I think, reminding ourselves of where we were and what was going on. We had recently heard the latest annual rough sleeping count statistics had been released in February. And what this showed was that there had been a very small decrease again, second-year decrease on those count statistics. And I think what this does indicate is that the impact of the government's rough sleeping strategy and initiative had started to make an impact in lots of areas. That rough sleeping strategy and the initiative had put extra money in, and we were really pleased in the spring budget that the government had put in an extra £236 million, which was a part of the story about starting to move towards implementing their manifesto commitment that we had in the December election to end rough sleeping in this Parliament. So at that point in time, I think we were starting to feel like we had a majority government where this was a manifesto commitment, and action was starting to be taken. The Prime Minister also announced that Louise Casey would be coming in to do a review of the causes of rough sleeping. However, some of the really big drivers of homelessness and rough sleeping still, we didn't think, were particularly on the agenda. So we've published research by WPI Economics just the month before, which showed that £1 billion a year less is being spent on what we used to call supporting people services. So that's support for people to keep them in their home. Obviously, all the challenges around welfare benefit systems, where we had LHA freeze and the benefit cap causing real issues. And then fundamentally, that huge shortage of affordable and particularly affordable social rented accommodation, which is so important for people who are vulnerable to homelessness. So all of those things are still there. And I guess we focus on rough sleeping because it's so dangerous. And 726 people died either rough sleeping or in emergency accommodation in 2018, according to the ONS. And the average age of those people is 45 for men and 43 for women, which is a really shocking statistic. So that was the crisis situation we were facing before the pandemic. And then obviously the pandemic hit. The government was saying, stay home, save lives. And obviously that's not possible for people without a home. And to their credit, the government moved very quickly, working with local authorities to get the everyone in message out there. And thousands of people were moved into hotels really, really quickly during March and April. St Mungo's mobilised really quickly, working together with our partners, our local authority partners and others. And we've had 2,700 people in the emergency hotels during this period. That was a massive effort by our outreach teams, moving services, moving teams around so we could provide the support in those hotels as well. So it wasn't just moving people into a room and ignoring the fact that many had support needs. We had to mobilise proper teams of people who had the skills to deliver that work in the hotels. The reason we did that, obviously, was that people who are homeless are already very vulnerable to the health conditions that we were seeing very quickly made COVID a huge risk. And so what was really important in this response was to make sure that people could self-isolate. So working with health colleagues, we diverted people who had symptoms into one hotel, people who needed the shield into another hotel, and people who were asymptomatic or didn't show any signs into other hotels. And it was really important that people had their own room, ensuite room. We then mobilised very quickly to make sure that food was being delivered to people. So really to minimise in that period of time when people were really in lockdown, to make sure that people didn't need to go into communal spaces and could stay in their room as much as possible. We also worked really quickly with health services to make sure that we were accessing the mental health and medical support for people, and particularly for people with substance misuse issues, getting people scripted. I'm going to go very quickly because I haven't got much time. I think what we and the sector knew very quickly was we wanted to take an opportunity out of the crisis, and the double crisis of rough sleeping and then the pandemic. Everyone in was a huge achievement. We worked very quickly to make sure we were getting the message across that local authorities were saying that they didn't have enough money to keep these hotels open for long. We ran a quick campaign called Going Back, No Going Back, and we were really pleased when the government announced ring-fenced money of the 105 million on 24th of June, on top of the capital and revenue allocation that they brought forward from the money that had been announced in the spring, which is now the Next Steps accommodation programme. So looking forward, I think there's a few things that we really need to focus on. And the first thing Martin mentioned at the beginning, the evidence suggests that already in the first quarter of this financial year, the stats from the chain database in London show that the flow of people onto the streets was increasing. There was a 77% increase in new people on the streets in that period. compared to the same quarter the previous year. I think we're very worried about the end of the furlough scheme, the evictions issue, and unemployment. So as we go into the winter, we've got a very big prospect of lots more people ending up homeless, potentially on the streets. We've also got a situation where the services that we've relied on because of the crisis in the past, the sort of night shelter, church-run night shelter and hub-type accommodation, which is with communal space, they won't be able to operate. And I'm particularly worried about what happens if there's severe weather and how we run the severe weather protocols, which we know have saved lives in the winter months in the past. Are we going to be able to open those sort of facilities, which was really, a mattress on the floor, people crammed into spaces? That won't be possible. So we need to make sure that we, through this next period of time, we can get people in safely into accommodation where they can self-isolate, and we're not putting people in a position where they're at risk. And I guess finally, long term, we're looking obviously at the spending review to tackle some of those fundamental issues I mentioned at the beginning. It's really important we get back to this issue about no recourse to public funds. It was great that we could bring people into the hotels who had no recourse, but getting people out again is a real challenge if the government are going to stick to their no recourse approach, even during the sort of pandemic. Long term, what we need is integrated housing support and treatment pathways for people with those complex needs. So the investment back in supporting support for people and long-term housing. And I guess finally, we need to fix what the pandemic and the rough sleeping situation shows is that we've still got a hole in the safety net for people who face homelessness. Too many people still approach their local authority, don't get the help they need or get the temporary accommodation because they're not seen as priority need, and they end up on the streets because that's the only place they can access help from in our system. So we really need to go back to that and fix that in the future. And we've started doing some work to think about how best to do that. So I hope that opens up a bit of the conversation. Very quick run through. Sorry if it's been too quick. My details are there. Stay in touch. And I look forward to the rest of the debate. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Dominic. A huge amount to pick up on in the debate that follows. And just a reminder to everybody tuning in to use that Q&A box so we can answer your questions as we move forward. So keep using that. I think there's already some questions coming in by the looks of it, but do keep using that. Right. Thank you very much, Dominic. Joanne, it is over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. I'm off video now, so this is going to be by way of a podcast. I am going to be very much reinforcing some of the messages that Dominic made, but from a London perspective, London local authority perspective. So in Enfield, before the pandemic hit, we were launching our ambitious strategy where we wanted to make a generational change in homelessness. We had the second highest number of residents in temporary accommodation in the country and the highest level of evictions from the private rented sector. So we knew that to tackle that, we needed a radical change plan to make the change at the scale we needed. So we'd also experienced a step increase in rough sleeping in the borough. And that was by way of a proliferation of encampments. So this was as a result of an outward migration from inner London to outer London, with residents and boroughs themselves looking for the relatively lower cost accommodation. And I say relatively because it's still expensive for our residents. But so that led Enfield with a real pressing problem and a housing market that just wasn't working. So during the Everyone In period, we accommodated well over 300 residents who were sleeping rough. And that included a very large with no recourse to public funds. So we housed the residents in a range of properties, including temporary accommodation, the PRS, council housing that we were unable to let permanently, and hotels in particular for people with support needs. And I think I'd echo Dominic's perspective. The loss of supporting people ring-fence has really exposed the resulting loss of supported housing, as well as all the infrastructure that goes with a supported housing function and service. So we really felt the loss of that type of accommodation in the borough during the pandemic. But having said that, one of the really positive outcomes of the pandemic was a fantastic way that the whole health system came together to support vulnerable people. And I'm talking every part of the health system. So CCGs, public health, mental health trust, everyone piled in together to support the needs assessment of these vulnerable people, making sure that they had access to a GP, perhaps for the first time in many years, for the groups, and make referrals to specialist agencies. So that was something that we want to keep and continue with going forward. Now, if you're in a local authority environment, you will be currently working on how you're going to balance your budget. In Enfield, we have a net shortfall this year of £30 million after the government has given us funding settlements. Simply is not possible to meet that from our reserves. So that gives us a real dilemma. We've applied for the two funding streams for move on accommodation, but the government pot, especially for the capital side, is inadequate to meet all of our needs. So our bid has had to be scaled down to 60 when we've got over 300 people to move on. There's also the question mark about ongoing revenue support and funding for those homes, but we've just to take the risk that that will be there beyond the 3-4 year period. But it's not something that, for example, a registered provider would seek to do. So our bid included a whole range of solutions, housing solutions, also work with our North Regional Partnership to draw in funding for support for people with no recourse to public funds. So the lack of funding is really a challenge for us now that we're exercised about. We're looking at all options, so writing to the RPs in the borough to ask if they can give us some additional one-bed units and access to supported housing schemes. Working with the voluntary sector, obviously they've had
Joanne, I think we've lost you. You cut out mid-sentence. I'm afraid unless I'll just give you a couple more seconds. No, I'm sorry, Joanne. I think we've just lost you. Apologies for that. Yeah, a huge amount to pick up from that presentation, and we'll hopefully be able to bring you back in. I'll just give you one last shout out. So, Joanne, are you there? No, apologies in that case. In which case, I will move on to the next presentation. We got through most of Joanne's, I think, but apologies for cutting out at the end there. Stuart, this is your 30-second warning that I'm just going to bring you back in to do the next presentation. And I should say, we seem to have plenty of questions coming into that question and answer box, but just a reminder to you out there tuning in, use that Q&A box and we'll get through as many questions as possible by the end of the session. Right, apologies to Joanne. I'm not sure if she can still hear me, but sorry, we can't hear you. So I'm going to hand over to Stuart from Global Guardian. Stuart, it's over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank Inside Housing for hosting this webinar and also giving us the opportunity to be part of this conversation. And also like to thank all the panelists today for their valuable insights into this really important topic. And also, Joanna had some really interesting things to say. So the issue of homelessness is one that's very close to my heart and personally, and was one of the main driving forces when we formed Global Guardians 9 years ago. And it's our belief as a company that everyone deserves somewhere warm and safe to sleep and to make memories. For us, a home is not just four walls, it's a lot more than that. But unfortunately, sad truth for thousands of people is that just four walls might not even be the best they can expect. So with the current amount of empty residential and commercial buildings around the country, it's our mission to support property owners to manage these assets effectively, whilst also helping them to repurpose them to help people and communities thrive. So as a company, we've kind of been doing this for a long time. So one way we kind of are kind of involved to help prevent forms of homelessness is to provide less expensive forms of accommodation so that people are less likely to fall into, say, financial hardship. As Joanna was saying, there's obviously there are cheaper accommodation in, say, for instance, Enfield and other boroughs, but they're still very expensive. So we provide a lot cheaper temporary accommodation, and for the people who live there as what we call property guardians, they do experience a lot cheaper rental prices. So with prevention being better than the cure, we'd like to see more private sector organisations supporting local authorities wherever they can. And so much of the responsibility for housing and providing vital support, especially to people who've fallen on hard times, currently rests on the public sector. But we believe it's everyone's responsibility to support their efforts, and it's never been more evident than during the recent pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, Global Guardians did whatever we could to fight against homelessness, providing the inexpensive accommodation and allowing people the opportunity to live and work in and around industry hubs. So this allowed them to maintain their careers in various industries, including the health and public sectors. And we have a lot of NHS staff living within our properties who are able to carry out responses, obviously, to the COVID pandemic from there. And our occupants, our property guardians, have avoided sofa surfing and living in overcrowded accommodation by choosing the property with us, because the properties we use, we're working through the social distancing, so you have a lot bigger space. People are far more comfortable in that regard in order to carry out their work. And we were looking at the figures the other day, and it basically, we kind of found out that we'd provided living space to several thousand people since our formation, and those people might have been otherwise subjected to the rising cost of private rents and fees. So we know that there are forms of accommodation that can be relatively inexpensive, but we also add the extra care into our properties to prepare them for occupation. So we ensure even the sparsest, like office floor, because we use lots of different properties, is set up in a habitable and comfortable way. We put carpeting in, white goods, painting and so on. And all health and safety management is taken care of by our expert team. So all the guardians live in basic but safe and comfortable environments without having to pay exorbitant rates for it. And a lot of this investment does actually come from our organisation. So obviously there's budget problems at the moment, budget constraints because of the COVID crisis. We've managed to be very tight with our own fundings, but we're putting it into place to help create new accommodation in areas where maybe a property was boarded up, or the local authority or the NHS didn't have the funds to actually convert it into a living accommodation. And we've been putting a lot of investment into that because it's a valuable partnership. And it reflects our brand values, especially our safe hands approach. We've also been involved with Crash Homelessness Charity every year since our formation, and we've helped over 1,700 key workers to find living spaces close to their place of work. But one thing we want to do more as a company. That's how we work. And again, for myself, before I found my place in this position, I've had times when I was living in London, sofa surfing, living in temporary places. So being a property guardian allowed me to pursue my career goals and also start Global Guardians in the first place. So it's something that I have a lot of belief in, and believe it can really help the public sector kind of tackle this challenge. So we currently have 25,000 people registered with us, and it doesn't include the people who are on council waiting lists for emergency housing, etc. These people are currently sole responsibility of the local authorities and associated charities. And it can cause a huge strain on the local resources. So we were contacted a few months ago by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government regarding their COVID-19 rough sleeping response initiative, and we were asked if we would be willing to work alongside local authorities to provide living spaces to low support need individuals during the pandemic in order to mitigate the risk of them becoming homeless. So as soon as we heard this, we're immediately on board. And we've been in numerous discussions with local authorities, putting in place plans to help these people during this time of crisis become guardians, and then may stay for a longer period of time working with us as guardians as the scheme progresses. So we hope to be able to provide properties in support of this effort as we progress. But there is obviously the challenge we have is the lack of available spaces we have to offer. But with the growing amount of empty buildings around the UK, both residential and commercial, there is a huge void between the availability and need. So we need to obviously reach more owners of these empty properties to work with them, secure the buildings and reutilise them as accommodation, because there's like a hidden homelessness factor at the moment, which we want to address. And we aim to form strong partnerships and work inclusively with more local authorities, NHS trusts, housing associations, to better help meet the current housing need, because we are in a unique position to help. We have the rapid ability to turn a building from a derelict condition into a working habitable property, and then place guardians in and look after the property properly. So we're very pleased to see the conversation surrounding this critical issue progress, but there is a lot more work to be done, and we're looking forward to continuing and encouraging other people to contribute towards the permanent ending of homelessness in the UK, and that's one of our missions.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and yeah, lots to take a look at. It's, certainly in terms of how some of that work has developed over the last 6 months as well. Thank you very much, Stuart. Lots of questions coming in, but do keep them coming, and again, we'll pick up on them after the final two presentations. Right, thank you, Stuart. Bridget, it's over to you.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone, and I would also like to thank everyone who's organised this webinar and those who are joining us for the opportunity to join in this very important discussion at this time. Action on Empty Homes doesn't work directly around homelessness, but we have been looking very closely at the dynamics of homelessness over recent months. And I'm just going to throw something out here, which is to look at homelessness from a more structural perspective rather than a sort of a reactive response perspective, vital though that is. So in terms of what we actually do, Action Empty Homes is a campaigning organisation. We work to raise awareness about the waste of long-term empty homes. We campaign for changes to national policy. We support local communities in transforming their neighbourhoods. We provide some advice to individuals seeking to bring empty homes into use. But the main thrust of our work, I guess, is trying to raise the profile of empty homes and trying to steer government resources and public resources around to actually bringing these homes into use. We're starting to work on a global level. We're one of the 3 founding members of a new global empty homes network, which has been really interesting, but it's also in some ways a bit disappointing that you see the same patterns, the same dynamics repeated. You know, we're not having these problems just because we live in the UK. There's something structural, systemic about the kind of issues that our communities are facing. Just looking at the scale of the problem around empty homes, the figures released in the autumn last year showed another rise of 10,000 long-term empty homes just in England, up to 226,000, which is just those which are registered as being empty for the long term. It doesn't include properties that stand empty and are not registered as such. The wider context of homelessness, you will all know this better than me. Martin's already corrected my 87,000 household figure to 93,000 households in temporary accommodation in March this year, including, you know, nearly 128,000 children, it's probably more by now, in unsuitable, overcrowded accommodation and costing a huge amount of money, over £1 billion a year just for the temporary accommodation, at least double that if you include the wider homelessness services. At the same time, we have a social housing sector which is being pushed down a more sort of business financial model route. Certainly the funding models have changed hugely in the time that I've been working in housing, creating a tension between the sort of traditional social interest values and in some instances leading to a more risk-averse climate when it comes to perhaps the more vulnerable tenants who don't have a very good track record. Welfare benefits, housing support, safety nets, these have already been highlighted. They're much less robust and much more conditional. And the private sector itself is suffering from a sustained lack of investment. Just quickly, our current campaigns are what you'd expect, I suppose, community action on empty homes. We're doing quite a lot of work at the moment around short-term lets and second homes, including the Airbnb market, and wealth investment, by which we mean that, you know, properties are built as residential dwellings, but they're never actually used as residential dwellings, but they count towards the delivery of new housing. Lobbying for more money, obviously, and for a more strategic approach. But over the last few months, we've been struck by the extent to which COVID-19 has exposed what we would call structural housing stress and the complete waste of empty homes. This is thrown out for discussion, really. We're looking at what COVID-19 is showing us, and we're looking at layers of inequalities. We've got more work to do on this, and you could start this list top or bottom. But if we start at the bottom, which is where we started, we looked at those areas where higher levels of COVID-19 were being reported, and we started to layer. So are those areas of deprivation and poverty? On the whole, yes. Are they areas that have high health inequalities and enduring health conditions like diabetes, heart disease, and so on? Well, yes, we found that they were. Do they have higher levels of overcrowding? Is the private sector relatively insecure? And what's happening to the homelessness trends in those areas, and importantly, the hidden homelessness in those areas, which is quite difficult to get at, as you know. And what we found was that we could overlap these areas. And we looked particularly around the sort of Manchester area, northwest, northeast. And there do seem to be correlations between these factors coming together and higher levels of homes standing empty. So in a sense, we've got a perfect storm. We've got a huge, sort of layer upon layer of structural health and housing inequalities, alongside high levels of homes just wasted, standing empty. And we're beginning to think that structural health and housing inequalities actually themselves create the structural conditions for homelessness. But this isn't something that randomly happens to individuals. This is something that is built in to the way that the housing market operates and the way that public funding is managed and disseminated. So that really is sort of our contribution to this debate. In terms of action, we're calling for the empowerment of local authorities and communities to act together and separately. For those of you who are aware, there is an empty dwelling management order, which is a means of local authorities bringing empty homes into use as rental properties for a period of around 5 years. Incredibly complicated process. The property has to be attracting antisocial behaviour. There's a tribunal system that takes a long time, and it's a complicated legal process. So we're calling for the length of time empty only to be the precursor for an EDMO, that the tribunal is used as an exception rather than as the rule, and that the whole legal process is streamlined. And that alongside that, we have a government funding stream for renovation of empty homes, whether they're possessed under EDMO process or through any other process, and that funding stream is available for local authorities and for communities. We've learned quite a lot in recent years about the power of community management of empty homes, partly in terms of the regeneration, sustainable regeneration and of community infrastructure, but also because communities can have their own local lettings plans. And somebody mentioned earlier that it's often the non-priority homeless who fall through the net each time. They can be scooped up through a local lettings plan operated by a community. We think local authorities should be able to spot, purchase and renovate properties along with communities, to some extent to provide larger homes for larger households. Because the problem isn't the size of the household, it's the unavailability of larger homes to accommodate them. And the final 2 points really are that we're aware that this is a revolving door situation and that we need investment in the private rented sector and control of the private rented sector to prevent future empty homes and also to help to prevent homelessness. And by using, sure, you know, new build has a very important role, but we already have empty homes sitting there waiting to be used. And from these, we can increase the supply of secure, affordable housing, which will both help to prevent homelessness and also provide more housing options for those people who do find themselves faced with homelessness. So that's the main thing that I want to put in today, hopefully of interest. And I'll be really interested to hear what people have to think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Very much of interest, and certainly several areas I'll be keen to pick up on in the discussion that follows. We're getting loads of questions coming through, but just a reminder, that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, do keep using it. We're going to have about 15-20 minutes for questions at the end of the presentations, so I'll try and get through as many as possible. Right, thank you very much, Bridget, and Julian, it is over to you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I don't know if people can see me.
We can see you, plus a sheet of paper. Yeah, we can see you.
That's all you need to see. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to present here. It's always good to talk at events like this. Now, I'm representing Bristol. Bristol's a city of about 500,000 people. It's got one of the largest numbers of rough sleepers prior to the lockdown and a significant homelessness problem. In recent years, we've got quite good at prevention. We're preventing a lot more people from becoming homeless. But like a lot of areas, we're less good at being able to find settled, move-on accommodation for people, and also to make sure people get the long-term support that they need to be able to maintain those tenancies and to be able to move on and live the lives they want to. In context, I think pre-lockdown, we had nearly 2,000 households in some form of emergency or temporary accommodation. That included about 120 people who were sleeping on the streets, over 1,000 people in hostels, and more than 600 families in temporary accommodation. So that was kind of the scale of the issue we were facing. Obviously, then came lockdown and the Everybody In programme and a scramble to get everybody in. I think since lockdown now, our total is that we have moved through and taken at least 900 people into emergency accommodation. We've currently got less than 300 remaining in an emergency accommodation. I mean, echoing what Joanne said earlier, you know, one of the great things about this was that everybody came together to provide wraparound support, to provide food, accommodation, healthcare, and I think the whole sector rallied round. But the question then is, what do we now do? And what we want to do at Bristol is use that kind of unique opportunity we feel that's arisen from the Everybody In movement and the profile of that to really try and crack some of those systemic issues that we found. So, you know, can we use what's happening in the housing market at the moment, the changes to the local housing allowance, that harnessing that joint effort? Can we combine that with government will and the Next Steps funding regime, and with the goodwill across the sector to try and make more than just a change for those people in emergency accommodation, but for those 2,000 families and households that we've got in any form of temporary accommodation, and for the next group of those people who will come through the system. What we've devised is something called the One City Move On programme to tackle these big issues. And we've divided that into two major strands of activity, one being accommodation and the other being the provision of person-centred support. So on the accommodation side, we think we can, again, make a massive change in the amount of move-on accommodation that we get across a whole range of different parts of the housing market. So we are working with other RPs and ourselves as a landlord to increase the proportion of lettings that go for move-on, to people moving out of emergency accommodation. We're doing the same with new build. We're trying to negotiate a top slice from all new build developments. We're also pursuing individual new build developments purely for move-on, or blocks within new build developments that are purely for move-on. We're building on Bristol's reputation for modular construction. We've got 3 or 4 modular schemes, hopefully for move-on in the pipeline. We're trying to attract more PRS landlords with the changes in LHA allowance and the uncertainty of the market at the moment. We're already more than doubling the amount of supply we normally get in. We've also got a campaign out for spare rooms for people who want to accept lodgers, for people with no recourse to public funds because it's very difficult to find accommodation. And again, the people in Bristol have responded overwhelmingly to that, and there's lots of rooms coming out for people. We think now with the changes to the LHA allowance, there's room for institutional investment in the market. People were coming forward pre-COVID, but now we think people wanting to buy portfolios of PRS and lease them to us on longer term deals, and we're hopefully running a mini competition for that soon. So through that accommodation strand of activity, we've already moved on to the 400 plus people. We've got a pipeline of about, I think, 11 or 1,200 units now, but we still need more. And we still need to keep developing, looking where those opportunities are. Sorry, you may have lost me there for a minute. It decided it wanted to block me out.
No, you're still here. We can still see you. And yeah, you're still loud and clear.
And the second strand of activity, which is equally important for us and which I think other people have highlighted as well, Dominic especially highlighted early on, the 1 billion that's been lost from the supporting people regime in recent years, is we need to get back to that place where people can get person-centred support when it's needed. At the moment, that's fragmented and people fall through the net. And, you know, there are a whole range of different support avenues out there for health, mental health, drugs and alcohol services, employment, financial support, etc. But most people have problems accessing those and not getting it when it's needed. We've launched a campaign called Change for Good, which is a joint piece of work. We've managed to get the NHS, the council and the voluntary sector to jointly sponsor that and work together. We've got a number of different ways in which we want to try and harness the ability of the sector to provide joined-up support. I think key to part of that is going to be the use of the single assessment process and being able to share information on clients and use that well. But also key now is going to be the use of pooled funding. We're trying to map all the funding that's out there and available across the city so that we can start to see how we can use that together. Ultimately, we want to kind of return to something that looks like supporting people. We would really love to see ring-fence funding for something like that. So overall, we think we've got a really good One City Move On programme, but it is still a massive challenge. And I think with the increase in homelessness that may well be just around the corner, it's going to become an even bigger challenge. We do think we need some increased asks of government in order for this to become a reality. We would certainly like to see things like the local housing allowance move up to the 50th percentile rather than the 30th. We'd like to be a removal of any delay period in universal credit claims. We would love to see government commit to ring-fenced longer-term support funding. What's been announced as 4-year support in the Next Steps funding programme has been really good, but I think it needs to go a lot further. In terms of the Next Step funding, I would love to see some less restrictive conditions on the next round of funding. It's been a bit Difficult to put in some of the schemes we wanted to put into that. And I think that's about it. I need to say, we need to recognise that this is about getting people back into settled accommodation. I recently met a guy called Bruce, who spent 2 or 3 years rough sleeping after he had a gambling addiction. He hadn't engaged with people, but actually it was everybody in thing that made him engage. And while he was there, he did manage to get the help he needed. He did manage to engage with services, and he's now got his own PRS property. There are lots and lots of people like Bruce out there. I think there's now an opportunity to do something more than ever before. We need to seize it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julian, and thanks very much all. We've got about 15 minutes to get through a plethora of questions that have come in, so I'm going to do my best. Dominic, you've had a bit of a break, so I'm going to bring you back in first. And there's a couple of questions. I guess one from me, actually, just on your one of the points you raised during your presentation about night shelters, severe weather protocols. I think you raised a lot of questions there, but it'd be interesting to get a take on where things are as they stand, because obviously this is something that is a imminent threat to people's lives, really, and just be good to know whether you think there are plans in place and where they are. And I'll kind of bounce that into a question from Paddy Gray, who said, do you think that emergency and temporary accommodation could be acceptable going forward, given behavioural changes in the types of accommodation that may be required post-COVID, particularly around shared accommodation and the lack of private outside space? So 2 separate questions, but kind of if we can kind of bounce from one to the other. Dominic.
Yeah, I suppose because of the scale of rough sleeping, we've had a dependency really on this sort of emergency night shelter type accommodation for quite a while. The SWEP, the severe weather emergency protocol, has been in place, I think, for about 30 years now. I certainly remember working at Shelter, my first sort of job at Shelter back in those days was doing research in the winter of 1991. When the severe weather came in, and Shelter were hearing across the country of hundreds of people not being able to access accommodation back then. So we've made really big strides in having this SWEP approach in every local authority and that expectation. But like I said earlier, it does really depend on organisations, providers and councils opening up very, very basic communal spaces as a sort of last minute emergency. And that is probably not going to be possible. We understand the government are working on some guidance around all of this, and hopefully that will come out soon. I think my fear is that the guidance might put the onus on local authorities to make the decision and to balance up the risk locally. And my fear from that is that you will end up with a real postcode lottery about where emergency accommodation might be opened and where it might not be opened. And I think one thing we've learned from the last few months is that it's absolutely critically important that we get people into a situation where they can self-isolate and that they want to be as well. They feel safe and secure and they can stay in their room and not spread the pandemic. So what I hope is that the government will support local authorities to make sure everybody can come in into self-contained accommodation, and we're not relying on those on putting mattresses on floors in training rooms or whatever we've had to do in previous years. But I think we're it would be good to get that clear sooner rather than waiting until we're right into the winter months to and actually facing the crisis before we get that resolved.
Very worrying. And something we'll scrutinise inside housing as well. Joanne, are you back in the room? I'm just going to check to see whether you're able to.
I am, Martin. If you can hear me, yeah.
I can hear you fine, in which case I'll throw that question from Paddy at you, if that's about learning about emergency and temporary accommodation and I guess standards, really. So his question was, do you think that emergency and temporary accommodation can be acceptable going forward, given behavioural changes and the types of accommodation that may be required post-COVID, particularly around shared accommodation, etc.? So, Joanne, if you want coming in on that.
I talked about our transformation programme at Enfield, and part of that is around changing the emphasis and use of temporary accommodation generally. So we have many residents who've been in temporary accommodation for years, a few up to 20 years. So we see temporary accommodation as something that is for short-term crisis periods. So we want to have at maximum 500 homes and people not in the accommodation for longer than 6 months. I think that in a highly pressured environment like we have in Enfield, we have to have emergency accommodation to meet the crisis needs of residents, regrettably, even though we are putting significantly more resources in upstream prevention. But for the foreseeable future, we have managed to COVID-proof our winter shelter, so 20 units with pod-style accommodation, which Public Health have given us the go-ahead. So there's independent self-contained units, and the shared facilities are well managed. So I think absolutely it's not a product that any of us want to have in the housing sector, but in crisis situations with such pressures, I think the reality is that we have to draw on that accommodation.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. And I think we'll come back to some questions about standards. There've been quite a few questions coming through for about Global Guardians, and for you, Stuart, about some kind of technical issues and standards. So there's a question from Emily about what regulations cover Global Guardians in terms of fire safety, gas checks, electrical safety, if placing vulnerable people. And another question from Joanne from Leeds. Do the residential homes meet the housing health and safety rating system standards? And do they need a licence, or do you or the owner apply to the local authority for a licence? And yeah, so a couple of questions for you there, Stuart.
Yeah. Thanks, Martin. Yeah. So the standards which we adhere to is the British standard, which is the BS 8584 2015, which we were involved in the creation, and that kind of has the basic standards for a Guardian property. So this is what all Guardian companies should adhere to when looking after buildings. And because it kind of falls in a security standard, but also people live in there as a kind of needs to also be tackled. So in terms of the standards with regards to the building, we obviously do the gas safety checks, the NIC checks, Legionella testing, fire safety checks as well, with fire detection systems, fire prevention, and also in terms of the internal compartmentation, etc. So we have fire risk assessments done, and the work needs to be dealt with to make it up to that standard as well, the Fire Reform Act. And we also work in terms of the asbestos regulation as well, because a lot of accommodation is quite old. So we come across that with asbestos registers. So we kind of conform to all of the standards, the statutory compliance. And we also, as a company, we have a unique system whereby when these certifications are due to expire, it flags on our system, and then the client who we're looking after, the property owner, they can see it on their side as well. So we upload it, so it's always in check. We're always 2 months ahead of the game, and we do work with subcontractors within an EXOR scheme, and also have our own internal people who do the work as well. And in terms of the HMO status of buildings, it does depend, because what we've seen is in terms of say, for instance, homes, we would normally place a limited amount of people in there. So you may only put 2-3 people per floor within the regulation, so they don't become requiring an HMO license, and you obviously don't overcrowd the building, and you basically still adhere to the same standards of the rating system. But in terms of the license, because this is quite a short-term accommodation, we very rarely do that. We have done in the past with buildings in Hammersmith and Fulham, where we looked after, basically it was a former house of multiple occupation, and we did it with guardianship living under licenses, and we had a very strict regime in place for preventive and maintenance. So it does depend on the property, but at the moment, due to the COVID situation and social distancing, we try to limit the amount of guardians, so you don't need an HMO, but you still adhere to the same standards, because one of the things we do as a company is we push for standards to be raised across the industry, and we have a lot of systems and people in place who kind of put that in place for us.
Thanks, Stuart. There's a supplementary question that just bounced in, so I think it was, and certainly I can't remember. Please, could you repeat what British standard number it is for the Guardian? Yeah,
sorry. Yeah, it's British Standard BS 8584 2015, and it's under the section called Protection by Occupation.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Stuart. Right, there are several questions coming through about supporting people, picking up on a couple of presentations there. Nigel from Newport saying, we in Wales are lucky that the Supporting People programme is still operating under a new name of Housing Support Grants. This has been crucial in tackling the current agenda, especially in temporary accommodation. Do you think the sector should push for a reinstatement of this approach throughout the UK rather than piecemeal initiatives? I should say that there are other questions which suggest that the situation isn't quite so great in Wales. So there's a bit of a mix, but certainly the gist is that something that we should be kind of adopting as a kind of standard approach throughout the UK. Where am I going to go with that? Julian, I might go to you because you said that was a part of your presentation. So back to you just in terms of your own council and that kind of wider picture.
Yeah, of course. But I do think it needs to be different. We do need ring-fenced support funding, and I think we do need to strongly make a financial case for that as well. That it is that preventative approach stops significant spending acute services later on and recovery. Where I think it needs to be more refined is that we know kind of a lot of stuff that works from people with lived experience, etc. Things like the navigator system that a lot of authorities, including us, have been using in recent years. We know that navigators work. The feedback from clients is that having one person who's the kind of primary advocate and the owner of your relationship and accountable for that relationship with you, who can draw on those other services as and when you need them, I think is fundamentally important to the success of any regime. And I think, again, going back to a supporting people relationship that is co-owned and probably co-produced by the organisations involved. Myself and a number of the other speakers today have talked about how much all the sectors have come together, health sector, voluntary sector, etc. at this point, due to the everybody in regime. And we need to keep that approach. It's fun, we don't need to lose that. So I think, yes, supporting people, but a new supporting people based around the person rather than just the funding.
Thanks very much. We're running quickly out of time, unfortunately. I'm going to bounce through a couple of questions very quickly. Bridget, I'm kind of interested in, I mean, obviously this is about sharing learning. There's lots of questions coming in about how we best do that, how we lobby effectively. I mean, I know you've been working kind of the Global Empty Homes Network. I just wonder, what international learning should we be picking up on, or how's that developing? And are we good enough, basically, at sharing, not just locally within our own circles, but picking up on best practice elsewhere?
I think what's been really interesting about the global work is that I think when we're all under pressure, we tend to look down and inward, to not see the parallels or to learn from what's happening elsewhere. And one of the things that we have produced actually a joint statement with our partners in Australia and America, and we've got links in Germany and Italy as well, where basically the dynamic of the situation is the same. There are long-term empty homes, there's increasing housing need, there's a reliance on short-term interventions. And I think the question that came up earlier about is temporary accommodation appropriate anymore? And I think we have to come to the conclusion that actually probably not, and that we need to increase the supply of secure, affordable housing. And that's the same. We're learning whichever country you're in. This is not unique to the UK, and there's a lot that we can learn from our partners elsewhere in terms of collaborative effort and also the engagement of communities in helping to resolve some of these issues.
Sorry, I think you might cut out a little bit there, but I'm just going to try very quickly a couple of sentence answer, if that's okay. But there's a question coming from Matthew. I believe we should be doing more to regenerate existing properties that stand empty. My organisation is quite focused on development. What advice would you give housing associations who might not have explored this option and choose to build over regeneration? Sorry, a couple of sentences. We're kind of bang up against time now.
I think it's building communities, isn't it? It's not about just building houses, it's about building communities. And for housing associations, I think really go through the funding that's available from Homes England, because it is possible to access funding for bringing empty homes into use. It's not all about new build. And partner with communities, partner with community housing groups, because they can also pull in funding to match whatever you can put in.
Thanks very much. That's incredibly useful, and thank you. And Dominic, I'm going to give you the last thought. Question from Joe from Flagship. England's Homes England's affordable homes programme, focusing resources on shared ownership, planning changes, directing resources at kind of first homes, other kind of market home ownership products. That's the overriding political focus, not meeting the needs of those experiencing the most acute forms of market failure. Where's the joined up thinking on this, and what should the lobby be doing next to perhaps change the direction? So Dominic, again, a couple of sentences and I'll round things off.
Martin, that is a massive question that can't be answered in a short amount of time. But I think there is something about there's something about winning the political argument with this particular government in the case for social rented housing. And I think it can be done because we've clearly seen through the Next Step programme there's a commitment to social rented housing for some groups. I think there's a commitment in the affordable housing programme for, I think it's 10% for supported housing. So we're seeing a shift there, but I think we need to win the argument, make the case in terms this government understand and support, and I think it can be done. In the past, council housing was a big part of the Conservative Party's agenda. There's no reason why we can't make that case again with this government, but we need to get the argument right, so it really does speak to this agenda.
Well, thank you very much, Dominic, and thanks for attempting to answer that question in three sentences. Much appreciated. I appreciate there's a huge wider debate which we will continue to cover in Inside Housing and hopefully through seminars like this. It just remains for me to say I'm really sorry we've run out of time. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to our panellists for an absolutely fascinating series of presentations and discussion at the end there. I hope we got through a significant number of questions, but apologies if we didn't get to yours. So yeah, thank you to all our panellists for a great discussion today. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks to Global Guardians for the sponsorship, so we could run the webinar as well. So yeah, thank you all, and see you soon. Thank you.